Master one
cards, and he just
Yeah.
went through them all.
He started that, did he?
That was many years ago. I forget what the song was now, but
How's that, Troy and everybody? Have we got sound yet? Could you just confirm in the chat room?
I can see
Sounds
it going
good
out
now.
now. Yeah.
Okay, all right. I'll start from the beginning. Apologies for that. Well, as I was saying, it was nice to have a 2-week break and I could get used to it. And so we'll see what happens. But I'm Trevor, aka The Iron Fist. This is a podcast. We talk about news and politics, sex and religion. With me as always is Paul the 12th Man.
greetings, Earthlings.
Shay, yet to have a pseudonym or alias, Shay.
Hello.
Joe the tech guy.
Evening all.
We're going to talk about politics. We're going to talk about footballers performing badly. We've got gender issues. We've got Scientology. We've got Amanda Stoker, a fair bit about her. We've got American wokeness getting into French society. We've got all sorts of things to talk about. So let's just get into it. So, of course, with all this talk about gender issues, it hasn't gone down well with for Scott Morrison. He's obviously taken a hit. He's seen as not performing well in this regard. And latest Essential poll showed approval rating for Scott Morrison had dropped by 5% and disapproval rating had increased by 6%. And basically, when you look at the breakdown, it was unsurprisingly women who had, in terms of approval, men were previously approving him 65%, and they still are 65%, according to this poll, whereas women approval of Scott Morrison was 59%, and it dropped to 49%. So no surprise. Well,
Yes, on behalf of men. Do you want to explain that one, Trevor?
Good point, Joe. Well, you see, I have low expectations. But you're right. Men's attitude to Scott Morrison in terms of approval did not budge a percentage point, but for women dropped 10%. Paul, do you find that surprising, unsurprising, matches your expectations?
I didn't have any expectations.
Right. Okay.
I don't know what to make of it, to be honest.
It basically says that for all the hoo-ha that's gone on over the last 3 or 4 weeks with this gender issues, essentially men couldn't give a rat's in terms of their approval of Scott Morrison. They think he's doing okay, and women think quite differently. In summary,
what's the female take on
I would have
this?
thought a few more men would have been disappointed by his performance.
Yeah.
I would have thought.
Is it that possibly they think that his handling of this doesn't directly impact them and their everyday life? Is that the...
It's just, do you approve or disapprove of the job Scott Morrison is doing as Prime Minister? I would have thought on behalf of all of Australians, how's he going? And there we go. That's interesting, I think, that it basically showed men thought fine. Women were less than fine with it. So that was interesting. Then there was a Newspoll came out, and that was in the Australian. I've extracted bits from that. So there's a really big chart here, which you can't even see, guys, because the numbers are so small on this one. But I've broken it down into little bits. But in terms of the two-party preferred, and we're looking at, they've broken it down into two-party preferred. Let me just give you the basic figure. At the moment, if there was an election, two-party preferred, Labor would get 51% and the Coalition 49%. So Labor ahead by 2 percentage points, apparently. But if you then break it down by gender, age, education, income levels, and religious belief, you get some interesting breakdowns of this two-party preferred information. So when it comes to gender, though, for voting for the parties, there's absolutely very little difference. The Coalition's the top line there, guys, and the Labor is the second line. So 49-51 matches perfectly male and female. In terms of age groups, heavily slanted for Labor in the younger age groups, heavily slanted to the Coalition in the older age groups. No surprise there. 64% in the 18 to 34 would vote Labor. 62% in the 65 plus would vote Coalition. And then there's a gradual movement between those. So no surprise. In terms of education levels, whether you've got a tertiary, not a tertiary, TAFE, it's kind of all the same. And that's interesting here in Australia. I know I've been reading stuff about what happened with Trump and the sort of backlash against the liberal elite and the Rust Belt and really one of the really defining features of people who voted for Trump or people who voted for Brexit was education. It was a big disparity between people.
Why do you bring Brexit into it?
Because both issues were the same. That there was people who were well educated with university degrees significantly voted to remain, whereas
the argument is the left political parties have lost touch with working class and are more concerned with minorities, which a white lower class person doesn't necessarily care so much about. They're more concerned about their working conditions.
And they were also quite resentful, what I've been reading, of how they've been perceived, that they have are perceived that they're not valued in a community, and this was their means
with
of
Clinton's deplorables.
Exactly. The basket of deplorables sums it up precisely.
And a lot of British people, Remainers, were referring to Brexiteers as racist, xenophobic, ignorant rabble, basically, weren't they?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So when you look at those two issues, there's often quite a disparity in opinion based on education. But when it comes to our Labor and our coalition voting, it really doesn't seem to be any difference significantly to speak of in terms of this poll. Income levels is another one. If you are on over $150,000 a year, you're very likely to vote coalition. But otherwise, not much difference amongst the income groups.
Why did you say before that you weren't surprised that older people tend to vote coalition and younger people tend to vote Labor? I was curious as to your reasoning.
That just matches my perception of how people vote.
Really?
You don't think older people...
Revolution tends to be a younger person's game.
There's a lot of old working class people who I assume would generally vote Labor. And a lot of young, affluent people who might vote
38%.
Generally speaking, though, it's a generalisation, but as you get older, you get wealthier, particularly if you've owned property. So people who have acquired property during their lives and are getting towards the end of their working lives, on the whole, generally speaking, will be wealthier than younger people who are starting off. So there are always exceptions, and those who hold a lot of wealth, or more than average, would normally vote for the coalition because they think that they're the party that will look after them hanging on to that wealth. So, when it comes to income, super wealthy, sort of 150, well, not super wealthy, but 150 plus a year, definitely likely to vote coalition. Otherwise, the other income levels, pretty even, not a lot of difference. Here's one, though, that's quite a big difference. They had Christians, 56% would vote for the coalition as to 44% would vote for Labor. So quite a heavy bias for Christians.
And yet still 44% would vote Labor.
Indeed. But let's look at some other ones. When it comes, so that was two-party preferred. So basically, based on two-party preferred, who are you going to vote for, which party? If you're old and you're rich and you're Christian, you'll be voting coalition. Pretty much sums up a coalition voter. Generalising, I know, but there we go.
It's a very gross generalisation, I have to say.
Yeah, but I'm picking out the highlights.
Okay.
Yeah. Morrison's performance, how has Morrison performed? And what we find there is a really interesting one with the Christian votes. If you're Christian, 73% of Christians think Morrison has performed well, as opposed to...
well, because he's all about religious freedom.
Yeah. So big numbers there for Morrison in terms of the Christian vote. He's definitely picked those up.
So the poll is determining Morrison's performance, or who you prefer?
What you think of Morrison's performance.
Okay.
Yeah. So, yeah.
So
yep.
Christians like him.
It's probably unsurprising, isn't it, that Christians would prefer someone who is very publicly a practicing Christian. Whereas Albanese, I think he occasionally says sort of, pious things that sort of to try and not alienate religious people. Whether or not he's actually a religious believer, I have no clear idea. Do you?
So
no.
Yeah.
I know he's divorced. That's all I know.
So with Morrison, 73% approve, 23% disapprove. When it comes to Albanese and the Christians, 41% approve of him and 44% are dissatisfied. So even though he is an Anglican and who said, I was raised on three great faiths, the South Sydney Rugby Club, Labor Party, and maybe it was Catholic Church, one of the churches. Like he's full on. Like he's not...
You don't think he's just making the right sounds to please the voters?
This has been him all of his life. He's a staunch Christian.
Really?
Yes. He said that the three great faiths of his life were South Sydney Football Club, the Labor Party, and I forget if it was Anglicans or Catholics. But
okay, maybe he's being very selective. You know, if he used the word faith, you're not going to talk about, loving to read or go bushwalking. You know what I mean? Faith specifically applies to religion. And in a sense, membership of a labour movement, like the Labor Party, some people would see that as akin to almost a religion.
Look, I see him
as football for that matter.
I see him as overtly Christian, and I just think that he's normal overt, whereas Morrison is so off the scale that he's blowing Albanese off the park when it comes to getting the Christian vote. That's kind of how I see it. He's traditional Christian.
How many times do you actually hear Morrison talking about religion? It's not that frequent, really. Most of the time he just talks about politics and normal stuff.
Most of the time.
So,
but more often...
Why do you say he's off the scale?
Well, because compared to what would be normal, he's far more overt than any other Prime Minister about his faith. So while it still might be less than 15% of what he's talking about, because he talks about infrastructure and announcements about COVID and all the rest of it.
I would say less than 1% of what he talks about, not 15%.
But whatever it might be, I can still say he's overt if it's compared to what is normal. He doesn't have to talk about it 50% of the time. That would be ridiculous.
But, I'm trying to think of...
You don't think he's overtly Christian?
Of course he's overtly Christian, but what I'm just challenging...
How many others have invited the press in to see him worship at church?
Yeah, look, I'm not denying that he's overtly Christian. I'm just saying that I think you tend to exaggerate a little bit.
But I'm saying he's overtly Christian. So where am I? And you're saying he is.
You said 15% of what he talks about.
No, I didn't say 15%.
Yes, you did.
No, I said it doesn't matter what the percentage is. He doesn't have to speak about it all the time to be overt.
That was my point. He doesn't speak about it all the time.
But you've agreed with me that he's overt.
But that's not to say he
speaks about it. And I'm saying he's overt. We're agreeing that he is overtly Christian.
Yeah, I just think you...
And you think I'm exaggerating.
I think you exaggerate his religiosity on the job.
But we both agree that he's overtly Christian.
Absolutely, because we've all seen, video of him in church.
So when I say he's overtly Christian, I'm exaggerating. But when you say he's overtly Christian, you're not exaggerating.
Well, if you say you're pretty convinced Albanese is a Christian...
Yes.
I've never seen Albanese... say anything.
You haven't seen him do Easter messages or Christmas messages, which is something that Scott Morrison has taken on. He takes on saying hopes and prayers when in the midst of a disaster. So he does refer to it more, possibly more overtly.
A lot of public figures use the term hopes and prayers. I can only recall once or twice when he's been actually speaking in his role as Prime Minister, talking about his religion. That was his opening speech, wasn't it? When he first came into the Parliament, or when he first became Prime Minister, he said something about his faith being part of his,
You can only remember him talking about his faith once or twice.
Yes.
Well, I can assure you he's talked about it much more than that.
Well, I'd like to see that on record. But anyway, I just think you overplay his religiosity.
If you think he's only spoken about it once or twice, then you shouldn't be thinking he's overt in his Christianity.
Why not?
Because once or twice wouldn't be overt.
Oh, because I've seen the videos of him in church where, as Joe said, he invited cameras in to witness him practicing his faith. But that was his time. That was his private, personal time. It wasn't him as Prime Minister so much.
Anthony Albanese has said he was raised with three great faiths: the Catholic Church, the South Sydney Football Club and Labor. There you go. That's the way it was described. Anyway, I'll maintain that Scott Morrison is one of the most overt Christians we've seen, and that in politics, and that the public, because 73% of Christians think he's doing a great job, probably think the same.
Look, I'm sure it counts for something in the minds of Christian voters. I don't doubt that is true.
Yeah. Dire Straits says, I'm not getting your point, Trevor. At least Albo is not making it his image. Well, my point is that ScoMo has, and it's been successful in terms of the Christian vote. That's my point. So, all right. What else we got here? What does Bronwyn say? Being overtly religious doesn't necessarily translate into political conservatism. Dan Andrews is a practicing Catholic and goes to church most Sundays, but he ignores Catholic teachings on social issues and leads a very progressive government. There we go. That's another opinion. Gender quotas. To what extent do you support or oppose political parties setting gender quotas when selecting candidates to achieve a representative number of women in Parliament? They asked Australians in this poll, and supporting the idea, 48%, opposing the idea, 36%. Shay, what do you think about gender quotas for political parties when selecting candidates? Good.
I think it works.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I think that it's certainly worked at the Labor Party. I think that what was I going to say? When I was thinking about this, I was thinking about this little experiment as having me here.
The podcast, yes.
Exactly,
yeah,
right?
Yeah.
So we've increased the quota.
Yes.
Have we increased the value?
I think we have.
Do you?
But
see, I don't know, because it's if I am a smiling observer, then perhaps it is tokenism.
Yeah.
But if I am actually contributing, then I am adding value.
Yeah. Well, you're not a smiling observer, because I said I'm not giving you that nickname.
No, you're far from
silent.
So it does work. Like, this is a great opportunity. This little experiment is a great opportunity for me.
Yes.
And but I don't know how the audience is responding.
Yeah.
But certainly when I look at it at a bigger picture with the Labor Party, we have they have really strong performing women there. It's not a case of it being tokenism. We have really strong female leadership there. So I think quotas does work.
For political parties. Yep.
For political parties, and
it
remains to be seen if it'll work for a podcast.
Was Shay selected on the basis of the fact that she's a woman? I didn't know that.
Well,
that was my only
qualification.
That was the only requirement.
Unwillingness to stand in front of a microphone.
True.
I think it was more than that, Shay. But we wouldn't have accepted just any female.
Of course not.
Yes, you would have.
No.
Yes, you would have.
I really don't think so.
No, but
You might not have had her back, but you would have accepted her for the first one.
Right. No. Well, no, there would be some vetting of some sort. I already knew you from our conversation, so you'd been vetted in that respect.
Okay.
But I was determined to have a female voice. So I was not wanting no matter how good the male voice would have been, could have been a PhD in news and politics and sex and religion, and I would have said, sorry, just not the right time, because I felt that it's good to have a female voice, not just for perspective from a female point of view, but it's also, this is an audio format, and just a female voice as opposed to blokes talking gives the whole thing a different vibe. And I was interviewed by the lady from Compass to do with stuff with the New Temple of Satan, and I said something about the podcast. She said, "Oh yeah, I've listened to it. It's pretty good." She said, "It's a bit blokey, but it's pretty good." And I thought, that's probably a fair comment, because it is quite blokey when you've got 4 blokes, and so I thought that's a fair comment, and so that added to my impetus to say, well, I'm going to put a quota on, in a sense, this podcast. And previously, I've been dead set against quotas. If you'd have asked me 4 or 5 years ago, I would have said, everything should be a meritocracy, basically, and quotas shouldn't come into it. But I'm gradually shifting on some issues, on some jobs and in some situations. So before we go on, I've been reading a book which is called The Tyranny of Merit by Michael Sandell, and you have to read this.
Not on camera.
The Tyranny of Merit by Michael Sandell. And basically, he goes into, like when I read a book, dear listener, I highlight as I read. And I don't think I've ever highlighted a book as much as this one. He goes into the tyranny of meritocracy, as in it's really, really hard to create a true meritocracy. And even if you could, it's probably a bad idea. And he goes into the reasons why. So we're definitely going to talk about this book in the future. So when it comes back to gender quotas, so, Paul, what do you think about the question, to what extent do you support or oppose political parties setting gender quotas when selecting candidates to achieve a representative number of women in Parliament? Do you support that idea or oppose it?
I don't support it. I'm still in favour of selecting people who have the greatest capacity to, fulfil their role as an elected representative in the Parliament. I don't think what's between their legs should have anything to do with it.
So I think it depends on the job and the organisation to some extent. So I made a comment here. I made a note here.
Oh, you mean generally or just in political parties?
In terms of the concept. So I think for political parties, it is a good idea to have some sort of quota. But I don't think that's necessarily the case for all jobs. And here's where I make the distinction. So I think, who really cares if a room full of software coders or call centre workers or Amazon pickers or mining engineers is one gender or another? I think in those situations, it should just be on merit. But when it comes to an organisation, there are some organisations and some jobs where a broad diversity of gender and age and race might be needed in order for the organisation to fulfil the purpose of the organisation. So if the organisation is to represent a community, it will need people from that community as representatives. So if there's a strange unevenness, it may actually affect the working of the organisation. So
jury.
So things, good point. Jury would be a good example. Police forces, advocacy groups, political parties, and podcast panels, I think, because you're trying to represent a community and you're trying to connect with a range of people and you're trying to draw on a range of perspectives for the roles that you're doing in that thing, I think that's where you could talk about quotas. And I might say, okay, the police force, yes, but maybe not firemen, because at the end of the day, you just need big burly guys who can climb a ladder and with a heavy
Did you
hose.
hear that? Big burly guys.
There's a physicality to it that means, okay, quotas may be not a good idea for firemen.
But there are fire women too now.
There are. So
big burly
fighters.
chicks.
Yeah. So, but in terms of police, a lot of police work is they have police in schools, they're in the community, and that's where people need to be able to relate. And so I think it depends on the job. And I think when it comes to politics, obviously you're supposed to be representing a community. And if you become totally unrepresentative or really significantly unrepresentative, you tend to cripple the organisation in terms of what it's trying to do. So that's where I draw the line. I wouldn't have quotas on every job. It would depend on the nature of it along the lines that I've described.
Is there a difference between an aspiration and a quota?
Yes, because an aspiration could be just ignored endlessly. I mean, the coalition has had an aspiration for 30 years, probably, for even numbers. But without quota, it just doesn't happen.
That's not to say they're ignoring it. It just might be that more men are attracted to stand for pre-selection in the Liberal Party or the National Party.
Or it's easier.
Yeah, but the question was, is there a difference between an aspiration and a quota? And one is you can fluff around and keep thinking about it for a long time.
Right.
And events never change and things never change, whereas a quota just forces the change, doesn't it? So,
but so it may or may not change naturally. You know, I don't think you can assume that it will never change.
I'd say it would, but if you want to really move things along,
artificially,
yes, it is artificial.
Of course, it is.
Yeah. So
well, maybe initially it's artificial, but I think as it develops, it starts to seem normal for women to be in politics, and then they're the obvious choice and the best candidate versus a quota.
So so that's my sort of thinking on quotas. Right. What else have we got here in terms of look? But I'm also starting to think when we looked at the last US presidents that we've had. It's almost reached the point where it should be, if you drew a lottery and just pick somebody's name out of a hat, you could potentially do better than some of the leaders that we're getting. So
it's sad, isn't it? Because I mean, there are a lot of really smart, ethical people in the United States. Why don't any of them become president?
So we've almost reached the point where just a random selection might give us a better result. You know, with our current parliament, I'd love it to run the experiment, but what is there, 150 of them in there total, senators and House of Reps, something like that, is it? Something like that.
How many now?
But honestly, if you just grabbed a random sample of 150 Australians and popped them in there, I think you could get some better results than what are currently happening. Yeah, people without agendas, without owing anything to anybody,
I
people
think
of goodwill.
Our jury service just proves it.
Yes, the jury service would be a good example. And people with limited experience who've come in from nowhere, who've kind of...
He might listen to the experts.
Yeah, like I would never say I agree with everything, say, Jackie Lambie has said, but she strikes me as sort of an outsider who's come in, who at least approaches things with a fresh honesty. And some of those...
or a fresh naivety.
Yeah, but some of those, but some of those more independent senators who've gone in from South Australia and others, I just sort of have it would be quite refreshing, I think.
Some of them turn out to be half reasonable and others turn out to be a waste of space.
Yeah, well, that's true.
But
you will get
worse than the current politicians.
Yeah.
Sometimes. I mean... I've always thought Pauline Hanson should not have become a politician.
But she came in as a coalition. She actually didn't come in from the outside.
Well, she was a Liberal candidate until they disendorsed her.
Yeah.
But, she's always been out of her depth, intellectually and knowledge-wise.
Okay. Moving on. Speaking of gender equality, there's a rugby league women's football star, Nita Maynard, has done her bit for gender equality as a rugby league footballer because she's been charged with assaulting some security guards outside a pub on a Friday night.
It's about time a woman footballer, had a bit of biffo with someone, isn't it?
It's just,
I suppose.
Women's rugby league has really come a long way when it's reached this stage of gender equality. That's where we were getting to with this one.
When you read this, Shay, did this story bring a tear to your eye?
No, I was like, I just immediately thought it's so funny how people get so gleeful about women behaving badly.
Well, they do the same with the men. I mean, let's be fair. Any professional male footballer gets into trouble, he's in the news.
Yes.
For sure.
Yeah.
Well, what about that politician who got knocked out up in Townsville?
Really?
Yeah. That just went away.
Just recently.
Yeah.
Which
knocked
one?
out.
Yeah, he got involved in a pub fight.
Right.
And he got knocked out, and police are investigating, and I think cautioned both him and the guy who punched him.
Right.
Because apparently words were had before.
Okay.
It wasn't purely one-sided.
Okay. Well, he's just doing his bit for professional equality. Not only footballers can be in a pub fight, but even politicians. I don't think we need podcasters fighting, and if you guys have to put your hands up for that one, I'm not. I'm not up for that.
Not my thing either.
No. Okay, just on rugby league before we move away from that. So we have this situation with footballers who have been charged with offences, rape or sometimes domestic violence, and the Australian Rugby League has a policy which they've enforced, which says, well, if you're charged with something of that nature, then we can stop you from playing. You'll still be paid, but you can't actually go on the field and play.
Stood down, as they say.
Stood down. So the Players Association said, well, we're not happy with that. And under their agreements, this went to arbitration. And after going through arbitration, the arbitrator said, nope, that's a fair enough policy. And basically the reasoning behind it was that it saved the game millions of dollars in terms of sponsorship, because sponsors are happy because they don't have people under this cloud running around with their logo on their chest, and keeps things squeaky clean for them. So, and they don't pull their sponsorship. So the Rugby League Players Association appealed and they lost, and that is now the law in terms of rugby league players. And interesting thing is it doesn't apply in the AFL. So they have not yet come to that sort of arrangement. So anyway, that's what the Rugby League is up to in terms of forcing players to stand down. Quickly on the Republic, another poll. And overall, in terms of supporting the Republic, 48%, opposing the Republic, 28%, and unsure, 25%. That's a lot of people who don't know.
I think because we don't know what model is going to replace it.
Good point.
And it's been roughly 20 years since the last referendum, so a whole generation has grown up since that.
Indeed. So when it comes to the unsure group, females 33% as opposed to males 16%. And still in the unsure group, it's predominantly the younger people, that 18 to 34-year-old age group. Shay, on behalf of females in the younger age group, why are you so unsure about a republic?
Well, it's one of the few campaigns I actually remember as a kid, and the campaign that the coalition ran was, if you don't know, vote no.
Oh, okay. And
look at that. That's what we got. We got no for a republic. What? So I think that it's just something that not really going to explore, get information on until it seems more likely, possibly. And if it's kind of ignorance is bliss, like why need to know?
That's fair enough. It's been a while since there's been a discussion, so younger people wouldn't have heard the debate.
But the referendum wasn't exactly run along party lines anyway, was it? Because Malcolm Turnbull famously was one of the leaders of the Republican movement, and he was a coalition parliamentarian.
No, he wasn't in Parliament at the time, party. Was he?
I think he was.
No, I think he wasn't in Parliament.
Really?
John Howard was
Yes.
Was anti-Republic.
Oh, I know Howard was, yes.
And
we have Paul
Turnbull wasn't in the Parliament at that stage, I don't think. I think he was a well-to-do man about town businessman who clearly was aligned with the Liberal Party, but I don't think he was in Parliament. So, there we go. Actually, Bronwyn made another good comment. Bronwyn's making good comments. Daylight savings finished, so Bronwyn didn't have to go to bed, so she can stay up for the podcast. And she said that one really good thing Jackie Lambie brings is her life experience. For example, I think Lambie's the only current politician to have been a Centrelink client. Like, that's a big thing.
I think Anne Alley is another one.
Oh, okay. But that sort of life experience is important when you've been on the receiving end of that. Okay. The whole patriarchy, well, the whole thing about the gender issue was still there. But this was an article from Crikey that I found interesting. I don't know that I agree with it entirely, but here's the concept is from Crikey saying about this whole Brittany Higgins and the Parliament House sort of issue with treatment of women. For reasons I don't quite understand, progressives have allowed this to be portrayed as an example of patriarchy in general workplace culture. But there weren't any stories of Labor or Greens depravity emerging. If any were circulating, we can be sure that News Corp would have brought them to the fore. Bizarrely, this has now been generalised, and Liberal women have been allowed to take a lead in the manner that depoliticises it. There may well be a problem with Parliament's workplace culture, but what has emerged is a problem of right-wing culture and of the Liberal Party in particular. The crisis is a measure of the defamation of personality and values within the Liberal movement. So he says every politician party attracts chances and weirdos. Liberals have now called time on it, but that's occurred only after there wasn't much choice. And he says here, this may result in the Liberal Party or the coalition bringing in gender quotas. And he says that if they do that, it will really be a significant philosophical change for the coalition to introduce gender quotas, because they're so keen on the market and freedom and not having things imposed, that to submit to a gender quota would really be crossing over to a dark side that they haven't had to before.
Surely Scotty's a believer in complementarianism as well.
In what?
Complementarianism?
Yes, that men and women complement each other. They have different roles in society.
Right.
And the man's role is to be a breadwinner and the woman's role is to be barefoot and pregnant.
Yeah, well, at this moment, Morrison seems to think that men should be in Parliament and women should be at home. That might be the case. But anyway...
And barefoot.
Anyway, so part A of the argument is that largely it's been a conservative issue. The culprits in all this have been seemingly on the conservative side, and not much has been made of that. It's just been painted as a general culture in Parliament rather than a culture of the Conservative Party. You don't see anything in it, Paul?
I think it's absolute crap.
Right.
I mean, it's obvious that Crikey is a left-wing rag, and they, want to support the Labor Party, and they want to take every opportunity to put shit on the coalition and the leader of the coalition. So that's hardly surprising coming from Crikey. But what about Julia Banks? She was a Labor MP, wasn't she?
Was she accused of?
No, after she left, she rounded on the Labor Party about their sexism. Didn't she?
I don't know about her, but I know Emma Hazar is, and Kate Ellis is writing a book about the sexism.
Yeah, Kate Ellis. She was a
politics across the board.
Labor minister.
But Kate Ellis was complaining about what Liberal politicians were saying to her.
Oh, so they were the ones that were going to push this story.
They were the ones saying that she slept around and
she was a Liberal.
Right.
And that's what she is saying. So she's saying they're calling her a slut and stuff across the room, and when she stopped, and so the Crikey argument is that so far all we're really hearing about is bad doings by the right, yet the issue has been painted as one of a culture of the entire house, rather than saying, hang on a minute, it seems to be all on one side of the house here. Well,
I don't think Julia Banks was complaining about Liberal staffers.
Don't know. I haven't heard of Julia Banks. I've been following this.
It's here, but in a more concerted way than Julia Banks did a few years ago. It's time to I think what's interesting about this is this whole thing is, wouldn't you say Rupert Murdoch's trained rats have been behaving very unusually, Paul? They've been reporting scandal after scandal of the Liberal Party. They've been reporting the news.
Everybody reports scandal. Who doesn't like scandal?
Well, this is what I mean. It's like if Rupert really is
there's an even-handedness in this.
That's what I'm saying. It seems to be... It doesn't matter which newspaper article, everybody's covering these scandals. So whether you're right wing or left wing.
I guess the thing is, there's been female journalists in the News Corp stable who have
complained. Led the way.
Yeah. Okay. The other thing, just a bit of homework. We were talking about Bridget McKenzie fortnight ago, and I was trying to make a comparison between her and Ros Kelly. I was saying how standards don't seem to apply anymore. And we got into this discussion about Ros Kelly and the comparison with Ros Kelly and the whiteboard back in the Hawke era.
It's a long time ago.
I'm just trying to think
all the specifics of that anymore.
Yes, and basically, the argument was, well, Senator McKenzie did resign. So what are you complaining about, Trevor? Like, it was a sports rort, Ros Kelly, she resigned. Bridget McKenzie, sports rort, she resigned. But the thing about McKenzie is she didn't resign because of the sports rort. She resigned because money was allocated to a club that she was a member of, and a gun club. That's right. And under the ministerial standards, she was in breach of a written ministerial standard. So the point was...
There's a conflict of interest.
And the point was, it's a written ministerial standard. So where commonly, my argument is that where we've been relying on unwritten rules of conduct and behaviour and historical sort of ways of dealing with things, that's been thrown out the window. My argument still stands because she actually ignored all the sports rort stuff and toughed it out. It was only when it was found that she was a part of a gun club that received money and there was a black letter law that said you're in breach of the ministerial standards, then she resigned. So
why didn't Morrison resign when his church got a grant for security cameras and lights and things around the church?
Yeah, well, he would have said he wasn't the minister in charge of that decision.
Of course, yes, somebody else would have.
Exactly. He would have said he pulled himself away from that. So anyway, my theory still stands.
Okay.
Right, we have a new patron, thanks to Mr. T, who's in patron via PayPal. Good on you, Mr. T. And because I'm so slack in revealing patrons' names, our tech guy Joe has organised for a scrolling bar to appear on the video of the names. So those of you who are watching the live stream would have seen things scrolling across there. So thank you for that. And were you going to put a QR code up?
I was. I emailed it to you, but I haven't added it yet.
Okay. We'll put up a QR code to give you a link straight to the Patreon account if you feel like it. That's appreciated. Andrew Lamming has been in the news. Not the most pleasant of fellows, it seems.
No.
Careful bending.
And been getting away with it for a long time.
Yes. Be careful bending over, filling up a fridge if you're in a skirt and he's around.
I don't think she was wearing a skirt.
Be careful bending over, filling up a fridge.
What I read was that her underwear was revealed above her shorts or something, on her waist.
Right. Okay.
So you shouldn't
be careful
invent details that are not there.
While she was bending over.
Be careful bending over, filling up a fridge, because some creepy politician might take a photo of you.
I'm not saying that was a great thing to do. I'm just saying that you have to be a little bit careful not to embroider the incident with your own details, Trevor.
But I didn't paint it worse than what it actually sounds
worse now.
You said
she was wearing a skirt. In other words, he was taking a photo of her knickers. And that's not what I read in the report.
But so her knickers were showing above her
pants. The waistband of her knickers. Okay. In other words, not her crotch.
I don't think I've painted a picture that was any worse than what's actually happened then. So forgive me, dear listener. But it's a pretty...
He's a pretty creepy guy,
pretty creepy incident, however you paint it. So anyway, turns out he was one of the guys behind the chaplaincy, instigation of school chaplaincy. Julie Bishop, Greg Hunt, Andrew Lamming, David Fawcett and Louise Marcus were the ones who proposed the pilot chaplaincy program. So that's one of his claims to fame. And this bit I didn't know was that Queensland Premier Peter Beattie announced $3 million for the chaplains, but he got beaten to it by Howard, who then announced $90 million for the school chaplaincy program. As Prime Minister, Rudd added another $42 million to the 90 from Howard. And then when Gillard came along, she raised it to 222. So I had
what
no
happened
idea.
To your beloved Labor Party?
I was not aware of how much the Rudd and Gillard governments had bolstered it in monetary terms.
But
I knew that
Gillard had opened it up to non-religious people.
Yes, and then Abbott. That's true. That. In her defence, she had opened it to non-religious, but we don't want any.
In her defence. In her defence, that is indefensible, the amount of money that she wanted to give to the chaplaincy program. I just think that's indefensible.
Well,
particularly for a woman who is not religious and should be aware of the harm that religion does in society.
But hang on, you're not listening. That she opened it up to non-religious.
Yeah, I'm aware of that, but she increased the funding.
Yeah, and in her defence as a counterpoint to the increase, okay, I wish you hadn't given them any money, but okay, she was thinking there'll be some secular chaplains in there. So in her defence.
Okay.
But so there we go. We can rail against John Howard for starting the whole thing, but certainly Rudd and Gillard didn't help. And of course then Abbott came along and said, no,
that's not enough. Yes, let's give them more.
Well, and more important, and just as importantly said, by the way, it's now just for religious people.
That's right. No secular so-called chaplains or...
Yeah.
What do they call them? You know, because they keep telling us that the chaplains are not there to preach. They're there to offer guidance and, you know, a sympathetic ear to troubled youth and all that sort of stuff. But trained, you know, psychologists or guidance counsellors would have been much better for kids, I would think.
Right. Yeah. So, okay, so that's that is the chaplaincy program. And quick mention of Scientology. There's been a couple of articles. There's links here to it, basically saying what an extraordinary amount of money the Church of Scientology has accumulated in Australia. And it seems that... Allegedly. And it seems that our tax laws are some of the most generous in relation to religious bodies or pseudo-religious bodies in the world. And we're something of a bit of a religious tax haven here, it seems, for the Church of Scientology. So the article is basically saying that other countries in the Scientology world are funneling money to Australia because it's a good place to keep money. That's how generous we are to Scientologists. So that's a sad indictment on our system. And there's an article there with links to it. And one of the things is that I think in the UK, for example, they don't even have charitable status. So
it's interesting. From what I read, they didn't have charitable status in the US either.
Mm-hmm.
And they embarked on a huge program of suing the IRS until the IRS finally gave in.
Yep.
And that was, I think, Leah Remini's book that alleged that.
Yep.
So are US churches always tax exempt? Aren't they?
If they get whatever filing from the IRS, they have to be granted.
You would assume they would all apply for it.
Yes.
Wouldn't you?
And the IRS had either taken it away or never granted it. And they basically just kept suing them until they were snowed under paperwork.
It might be a little bit like the UK system. So in Australia, charities, including religions, have to pass a public benefit test, but it's automatically presumed that religion is for a public benefit. Whereas in the UK, it has no presumption about public benefit for religion. So as a religion, you have to prove you're doing charitable works and prove what you're doing with your money. So in the UK, Scientology has not passed the public benefit test and is not a charity.
Seriously? That's interesting.
Yeah, so that's all here in this article.
And is that how you would sort it out?
Yeah, that's how you would fix it in Australia, is you would say, just because you're a religion doesn't mean a public benefit. You have to show us what you're doing with the money. And another group will have problems with that is the Mormons. Like the Mormons collect a lot of money, but you don't see them up to any charitable work either. So there'll be another one who has a problem with that. So in terms of assets per member, the Catholic Church in Australia has assets of about $5,600 per Catholic member. 5,600, and Scientologists have 102,000 per Scientologist. They got a lot. There we go. So a couple of stories there about Scientology and just a little bit of history about it. That campaigning by the Truth newspaper in Victoria and the medical establishment led to a lengthy inquiry in the mid-60s. And its report about Scientology was scathing. It was described as evil, and its practice as a serious threat to the community, medically, morally, and socially. And its adherents sadly deluded and often mentally ill, the report said in the 60s. And the fallout was huge. Scientology was banned in Victoria, the first place in the world. And later in South Australia and Western Australia. Within a few decades, however, Australia swung entirely the other way, and we had the famous court case where it went to the High Court, and the High Court had a very generous interpretation of religion and said that, quote, charlatanism is a necessary price of religious freedom, and a lack of sincerity or integrity from a religious leader was not incompatible with the religious character of the beliefs and practices.
Go Church of Satan.
Indeed. So it's a terrible precedent that Australia has set. There we go. A little bit of history on Scientology, and there's a law to change in terms of the charity laws and public benefit. That's an easy one. Right. Hello, James. The chat room has just joined us. Now, Amanda Stoker, she's now kind of in charge of the Religious Freedom Bill and getting that along Parliament with sort of Christian Porter out of the scene, Michaelia Cash, new Attorney General. She's the assistant, Amanda Stoker. She loves the idea of a Religious Freedom Bill, and she's a fanatic, and she's very smart. She's a really dangerous woman, Amanda Stoker. She worries me a lot. So, Paul, you wrote...
Dangerous? Why is she dangerous?
Because her views are opposite to mine, and she wants to implement things that will be harmful for our society, and she's smart enough and hardworking enough to convince people to get it done.
Okay.
That's why I think she's dangerous. Right. Yes, yeah. So, so anyway, have you heard about these satanic shoes? They've been in the news.
Yes.
So, I don't even know who Lil Nas X is. Is he some sort of rapper?
He's a rapper who has recently come out, and apparently a lot of what he's doing is rebelling against the shame that he felt for being gay, raised in a very Christian society.
So he's got a grudge and he's working on it. Okay, good on him. So he brought out a satanic shoe where basically they grab Nike shoes and colour them up and insert some blood into like the gel area of the shoe. And
is that real, or was he just saying that?
No, it's real.
Real blood?
Yeah. Apparently they just got a bunch of the workers together and just extracted blood. And like there's only 1 or 2 drops in there, but it's got blood in each shoe. And selling them for a fortune. And Nike said...
They weren't happy, were they?
No. Well, you can't just take our shoe and use and associate us with your activity. So they've taken him to court to try and stop him. Meanwhile, though, some other company had produced a Jesus shoe. I don't know what was in the Jesus shoe, whether it had the body of Christ, perhaps. Maybe they'd taken a Eucharist and
a wafer,
perhaps,
and just put a wafer in the shoe.
Or maybe
and some wine.
Or maybe they'd taken some wine, transformed it into the blood of Christ, and then put that in the Jesus shoe. Oh. That is possible.
Yes.
But Nike said Mike didn't complain about a Jesus shoe, but now they're complaining about a Satan shoe, saying that looks like clear discrimination.
That's bigotry, isn't it?
That's discrimination.
Yes.
Treating people differently because of their religion. Mm-hmm. So the Satanic News at Temple of Satan said, well, if that happened in Australia, the new proposed religious discrimination bill that Amanda Stoker is trying to bring in would give this guy, Lil Nas X, the opportunity to continue what he's doing, saying it would be discrimination not to allow him to when they've allowed a Jesus shoe.
Yeah, I don't know about that, because Nike would obviously claim that, they didn't produce the shoe, and it's not authorised, and they feel it will bring their good name into disrepute. So I think they'd still have a case, wouldn't they?
Look, I wouldn't want to have a lot of money riding on it, but anyway, it's just making the point, if you can have these privileges, they can apply everywhere. And, look, there's been a lot of talk about Senator O'Neill on the Labor side getting very pally-pally with Senator Stoker about Labor Party policies that might actually be in favour of a religious discrimination bill, and it unfortunately will not surprise me in the least if the Federal Labor Party rolls over and agrees to whatever Amanda Stoker wants with this bill, because
they'll
Senator
roll over like a puppy and ask Amanda to scratch their tummy. Don't think?
Yes. Yeah. Yes.
Wouldn't surprise me in the least.
Yes. Yeah. Look out for that. Apparently she wasn't quite as conservative in her early days. She was more of a libertarian, Amanda Stoker. And it was only in sort of building up her base for getting pre-selection that she took on these sort of conservative Christian views more than she had before.
Yeah, you have to be a little bit careful with this term libertarian, because it doesn't have a really clear definition. You know what I mean? I mean, these political compasses that we all do for fun around election time. I did one just recently that somebody had referred to on my Facebook page. So I did it just for fun, and I came out exactly as left as the Greens.
No surprise there.
And a little bit further south on the libertarian spectrum than the Greens.
Only a little?
Well, the Greens were too. You know what I mean? The Greens were heading in the same direction as me. I was just further along than they were.
That's no surprise. But does not surprise me in the least.
It surprises me. I would have thought the Greens would be heading in the opposite direction.
You are in total agreement with the Greens, except when it comes to identity politics.
I'm not in total agreement with the Greens on everything.
You're in close agreement with the Greens. It's the woke talk on identity issues.
A bit more than that, sure.
That is your big difference with the Greens.
Well, that's almost their total platform these days. But
actually, they're thinking of a wealth tax.
Are they?
Yes. Yeah. And I think, Paul, that's unfair.
But the opposite of libertarian is authoritarian, right?
But hang on, can we just backtrack 1 minute? I think it's very unfair to say that's their total policy is identitarian identity
90%.
issues. I think that's very unfair. 90%. Yeah. Have you looked at their policy platforms, Paul?
I have.
And 90% are on identity.
I'm exaggerating.
Okay. There we go. I just couldn't help.
I'm playing with you. Yeah. But yeah, anyway, they're pretty heavily into it.
Yeah. So anyway, according to this article, Amanda Stoker was kind of more of a libertarian, which I take to be free market.
So she's just like me.
Low government intervention, freedom of the individual to do pretty much whatever they like as much as possible. That's sort of that's libertarian. Anyway, she's certainly adopted a lot of conservative Christian views, and it's worked for her so far. Okay, Paul, I think I got this one from you. American woke culture in French life.
Did you?
Yes, in Paris. There was a call to ban white people in France from talking about racism, which has split the nation and has triggered indignation
it's
on
from
the
Courier
rise
Mail.
of... Oh, maybe it didn't come from you then.
I don't read the Courier Mail.
Okay. I was thinking of you
That's
when I saw
one
it
that
then.
you read,
I probably looked at this and thought, well, Paul will like this one.
Okay, fair enough.
So, Andrei Pulver, a left-wing deputy mayor of Paris and former TV news presenter, said white people should be asked to keep quiet and be silent spectators if they were present at a meeting of black and ethnic minority people discussing discrimination.
Amazing.
I think we can all
What's
talk.
so amazing? When you ask the people experiencing discrimination about their discrimination, what is so outrageous about that?
White people are never discriminated against?
I'm just saying that I think a call to ban white people from talking is a bit... That's not what he said. He said they were asked to keep quiet and be silent spectators if they're present at a meeting of black and ethnic minority people.
Okay, they were allowed to attend.
They're allowed to attend.
Actually, they were banned from talking.
And they're asked, not banned.
Yeah. Okay, but
he said should.
Yeah.
White people should be asked to keep quiet. In other words, he strongly believes they shouldn't make any noise.
When discussing discrimination that black people are experiencing, black and ethnic minority people are experiencing.
I think they should be able to talk.
Surely.
I think they should be able to talk about a topic. I think it's a bit much to say, all you white people over there, shush, and just listen to us.
It's discrimination. It's racist.
It's just not going to solve... That is not going to win people over. If you say to people, you're not allowed to talk and you just have to listen to us and we're not going to let you convert... People might say, oh, well, that's what you did to us for 50 years. But that's not how you solve an issue.
That's right.
You could say, well, that was bad then, and that doesn't mean fixing it means you do the same to somebody else. If you say to people, you do not have status to engage in this, well, you've just basically signed a death warrant for reaching agreement on things in a willing, participatory manner when you just disenfranchise people. Now, you might say they're privileged and they're all-powerful and all the rest of it, but you're not going to win over hearts and minds by saying to people, in your corner, shut up while we tell you what we're experiencing. By all means,
let them speak
and give their 2 cents worth or whatever. But don't say to other people, well, you're just not entitled to talk on this topic because you're the wrong colour.
Another similar example on a black atheist page on Facebook that I look at sometimes. And they put up a photo of an African-American man standing in front of his church, and he was the preacher, and he had put up a sign advising black people not to go to churches where there were white people. In other words, he was saying black people should only go to blacks-only churches on the grounds that, white people have been so mean to black people for so long that they don't deserve black people's company. Or you know what I mean?
Yeah.
But
that's not how you solve.
It's not helpful.
Problems.
No.
Just in the chat room, Liam says, probably depends on how much they were talking. If it was 80% white people, then they'd probably have a point. Eric says, I think it depends on the contribution they want to make, Trevor. A lot of people get involved in conversations for no other reason than to stifle it. But sure, if somebody is not conversing in good faith and is trying to dominate and not allow proper discourse, well, that's not right.
But that's got nothing to do with their skin colour.
But if that's your concern, then you should be saying, hey, we want everyone to have a go and everybody to have their piece, say their bit, and we need to talk about this properly. Not say, oh, you whiteys over there, sit down and shut up. That just isn't going to work. It might feel good and it might get it off your chest and it might be great to just let loose. But if you're actually trying to achieve a workable consensus of everybody, am I talking over the top of you now, Shane?
No. I see your point.
Right.
Yeah, but I'm just like looking for the context of this.
You want to know the
whole
pretext.
Thing, the pretext.
You want the pretext,
context.
the context.
Because frankly, like, what can white people contribute to a lived experience of a black person discussing discrimination?
How about...
Can't we let the black person discuss their experience of discrimination, and perhaps the white person will then have something to add?
Yeah, but we're not saying that white people have to speak first. Sure, the black person can speak first, no problem.
Thank you for that.
But at least let the white person speak afterwards.
And maybe the white person has lived in some other country where they've experienced racism themselves.
Possibly.
So
we
they
don't
have something to contribute.
Yes.
And it's not only about lived experience. People bring, the entirety of their life experience, which is not only lived experience, it's also things they've read.
And prejudice.
But all kinds of stuff.
And for example, the black people might say, oh, I've just experienced this discrimination because of this hardship and that hardship and this hardship and that hardship. And the poor white working class trailer trash might say, I've got some news for you. I've experienced exactly the same thing. We have a shared experience. Isn't that interesting?
Shut up, Whitey.
Thank you. Oh, exactly. Like, it's just a nonsense to say, don't speak, because it's to say I can't learn anything from a white person. And even if it is a wealthy, well-to-do person who's had all the white privilege in the world and hasn't had a single bit of discrimination ever against them, they might say, well, what's your solution? And let me think about whether I see problems with your solution in actually implementing it because of my experience. Like, it's just to say to somebody, don't talk.
We're also seeing this, my lived experience is more important than education. Where, my lived experience, my child had autism a week after they had a vaccination. Never mind the 20 years of epidemiology you've done that proves that it's not true. My lived experience says that it is true, and therefore...
The white guy in the corner told to shut up might be a sociologist with 35 years' experience in the field.
Exactly.
He might have a lot of things to say, yeah.
I think, yes, there are times when it's valuable to shut up and listen.
Of course. But you've got to have a turn eventually yourself, yeah. Anyway, bits might have been lost in translation. French President Emmanuel Macron has attacked social science theories imported from the US. He said it's harmful for national unity and opposing French values. And this is the... I'll move on. So there we go. Now, on the same topic, is the UK a racist society? Paul, I got this one from you. So...
well, it's about the UK government commissioned an inquiry because of all the events of the last 12 months, Black Lives Matter and other things. And so the UK government, in response to accusations that the United Kingdom was a systemically racist country, they got a bunch of people together to find out if it was true, and they came back and said, no.
Pretty much there's no systemic racism.
They didn't say there was no racism in the British population. Obviously, every population has a certain number of people who harbour racist attitudes. But what they did find was there was no evidence of systemic racism. And it was interesting because people sometimes portray it as white versus everybody else. But what they found was that the children of non-white immigrants there were differences between ethnicities. For example, the children of like Jamaican or West Indian immigrants fare less well than the average white school child, whereas Africans...
But then the average white child fared less well than virtually all the other ethnic minorities.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And also in Indian immigrants tend to have a higher average income than Pakistani, for example. So there are all kinds of disparities among various non-white communities.
It's a very interesting report. So there's a link to the article from the BBC, a link to the report, and basically the Commission on Race and Ethnic Disparities said family structure and social class had a bigger impact than race on how people's lives turned out. It said children from minority ethnic communities did as well or better than white pupils, but overt racism remained, particularly online. So there's still racism, people abusing people, nasty comments made online, but in terms of systemic holding back of people from progressing in society, there wasn't the systemic incident that people were saying.
Don't you think social media is a bit of an amplifier in a sense, isn't it?
Yes.
And it's not necessarily representative of the community as a whole, I wouldn't think.
Interesting thing here, the pay gap between all ethnic minorities and the white majority population had shrunk to 2.3% overall and was barely significant for employees under 30. Okay. While there are impediments and disparities that do exist, they were varied, and ironically, very few of them are directly to do with racism. The report added that evidence had found that factors such as geography, family influence, socioeconomic background, culture and religion had more significant impact on life chances than the existence of racism. Said, Tony
Sewell.
Yeah, and there's a picture of Tony Sewell, the chairman of the group who did it, and it's an interesting report, I think. So I'm particularly interested in the bit where it's really talking about class and socioeconomic status.
My UK friends are very identitarian, and they were poo-pooing this report.
Of course.
And one wonders whether that's just, what do they call it now? Pre-bias.
Did they actually explicitly say that? This report is poo-poo?
Well, I'll tell you what they said.
They explicitly said that.
They said some pretty strong things.
No, they made some disparaging jokes about the report.
Here we go.
So they don't think it's true? Or?
They don't believe it.
No.
So they think there is systemic racism still alive and well in England?
Significant number of people disagree. So Professor Kehendi Andrews, a professor of black studies at Birmingham City University, said, "It's complete nonsense. It goes in the face of all the actual existing evidence." And a Dr. Halima Begum, chief executive of the Runnymede Trust, a race equality think tank, said she felt deeply, massively let down by the report. So there were other groups who said the report's BS.
Which they would. It's hardly surprising that they would say that.
So your friend, Brendan O'Neill from Spiked, said,
I wish he were my friend.
Said that, well, of course, those groups who are in the business of complaining about racism will complain about a government report that says there is none because it's directly going to affect their business that they're in. So that was his theory.
Similar thing happens in the United States with African American intellectuals who don't, follow the standard, Black Lives Matter rhetoric, and they get accused of being race traitors and coconuts and all sorts of things too.
Yeah. I'm just trying to find the qualifications of the head of this.
The interesting thing was because the Asians are doing so well in American life, they're now being reclassed as white.
Yeah, white adjacent is the term they use.
Because they were taking a overly non-proportional number of college seats.
Yep.
So it's a 258-page report. It does make 24 recommendations. So read that at your leisure and decide whether the people who wrote the report are full of shit and have written something that's completely off beam and they've got it completely wrong, presumably because they're either stupid or because they're motivated
by money,
by something else.
Why money?
So or something. Because why?
Just often with these reports, you do kind of follow the money. Like even when it's peer reviewed, who's it peer reviewed? You know, unconscious biases and all sorts of interesting things go into these types of reports.
Yeah.
But I can't see why we're opposing this report or why people would poo-poo this report. But
the people who poo-pooed it are the people who claim that the United Kingdom is a thoroughly racist country.
But on what grounds?
And you see, I think those people
would say it is.
I think those people would have an experience where they're working in community centres and they're dealing, say, with black people all the time. In a particular suburb, area of London or whatever, poor black people coming in with lack of opportunity and they're helping them out. And you could be in a position where all you see all day is just black people with difficulties, and you would go, there's a problem with racism in this country because everybody I see is black and disadvantaged and the system seems to be stacked against them. But if they went to some northern town or some other area of industrial old UK where, I don't know, there could be a working class white example of that they're just not familiar with. So I could understand people who work in a sector that deals with cultural minority groups and sees their problems, sees things through that prism and doesn't recognise that, hang on a minute, this is just happening to other people as well. And I just don't see it because I'm in this sector. I'm in the helping black people sector. I'm not in the other sector. It's quite possible people could see that and haven't taken an overall view of, hey, hang on a minute, it's more than race. It's socioeconomic. It's other factors that apply irrespective of the skin colour. I can see they could have that honestly held opinion and be wrong. I don't know that there's money in it. I don't know why a government-appointed body would make a 258-page report.
You will recall you and I, Trevor, read some books by a man called Malik. Is it Malik?
Kenan Malik.
Kenan Malik. And he made the point that in the 1970s or 80s or 90s in the United Kingdom, the government was throwing money at community groups, ethnic minority community groups in a way of trying to curry favour or look as if they were addressing certain problems.
Well, I saw it as a easy manner of delivering support to groups via the community leaders,
so-called leaders,
who often were religious leaders.
Yes, particularly in the ethnic minorities, they're often religious leaders.
Yes,
but in that sense, I guess there's money in claiming that there is systemic racism. Because then they would claim that they're still terribly oppressed and they need more government money to be thrown at them.
So in a report where it says the Chinese are evil and they're doing all sorts of stuff in the South China Sea and we need to beef up our defence response to that, by all means look at, did the person write that report in any way involved in the arms industry? In which case you can see a connection and say, I'm going to take what they say with a grain of salt because there's clear money potentially involved here.
Yes.
I don't see the same flow of money as a result of a report like this, but somebody else might.
Hasn't he saved money? Because basically they don't have to do anything.
No,
because they don't have systemic.
No. He's saying it's a socio-economic problem. So address the money based on class rather than race. So he hasn't, I don't think, said cut money and funding to these groups. He's just said the problem is not the race, it's the class.
As for his background,
yes,
he is a child of Jamaican migrants. He was a teacher. He taught in Jamaica, and he is a consultant, an education consultant. So he has been involved in reforming London schools.
Presumably, he didn't do it alone. There was a bunch of people on the panel. If his report was true and what he's describing is true, it doesn't surprise me that there would be a bunch of people who would say, I disagree, I think it's shit, and it was way off beam. Even if it was true, it's human nature. It doesn't surprise me. So,
and it does seemed like a sensible report. Like, I don't actually really object to it.
Anyway, there's a lot to read there if you're interested, dear listener. There's links to it there. So, okay, we've got here Liam. Liam McMahon says, it wouldn't be great to release a report saying that you have institutional racism. That would mean you would have to do something about it. Not saying that I don't believe the conclusions of the report, just saying there is a basis for not wanting to declare as the country's government that you're systematically racist. Well, the counter-argument to that, Liam, is if he's saying it's not a racist problem, but it's a problem of class and privilege due to money and other circumstance, that doesn't absolve the government from doing something about it. So he's still saying there's a problem, it's just not the problem everyone thinks it is. He hasn't said there's no inequality. He said there's a problem, but it's look over here, not over here. All right.
And it's not just about whites and non-whites.
Yeah. That was an interesting report.
And timely too.
We're going for time. 8:52, 8 minutes. Landon Hardbottom. We will fulfil another 8 minutes to keep Shay from being suspended above the shark tank. Let's talk about bias and the ABC.
Yay.
So, Paul...
Did I send you this one?
I think I just saw you commenting on it. I think
Possibly.
Maybe you...
I probably posted something about it on
I think
my
you did.
page.
And there was an article from The Spectator that basically said, if the ABC is so great, why aren't people watching it? Why do people say that they wouldn't pay much money for it? And why do people say it is left-wing biased? Well, clearly it is left-wing biased. It was the three things from the article. So I'll just deal with the bias one. So you've got a friend on your... Can I mention his name?
I don't
Brian.
mind.
Brian. We'll just say Brian.
He's an academic.
Right. Okay.
Did you know?
No. No. Oh, yes. He says it here. He teaches politics or something. First year politics.
Yep. I think he works online.
Right.
But it's for a university in Victoria, I think he works for. I won't name the university.
He teaches a first-year unit called Australian Politics.
Yes.
Yeah.
And he often comments on American politics when there's an election too. He seems to have a particular interest in American politics.
Right. Okay. He says, contrary to popular belief, Australia does not have a major left party. Labor actually sits on the right of the political spectrum. The ABC presents its news without general bias and positions itself in the dead centre of the political debate. But with Labor to the right of centre, it's closer to the centre than the coalition, which explains why many people think the ABC is more aligned with Labor because it is to the extent that Labor is closer to the centre than the coalition. So that was his argument. Incidentally, he says the US Democratic Party is to the right of our Conservative Party. I think it's true there. So he, I guess, is saying ABC is dead centre. It's not biased. And I know you disagree.
I disagree.
Yes, you disagree. And I thought I'd do a bit of Googling around and see what stuff is out there. And a bit of it's old. So I came across a petition where this person was saying that wanting to hold the ABC accountable for providing a balanced diversity of views. And it was talking about the ABC's The Drum. And again, it's old. It's back in 2011, 2012. And they said that of the 9 think tanks represented on the ABC's The Drum during that 12-month period, the Institute of Public Affairs took 39 guest spots out of 93. So that was 42% just for the Institute of Public Affairs. And then it lists there a bunch of other think tanks that appeared on The Drum. And in the end, comes up to a figure of the conservative think tanks were 66%, the progressives were 29%, and independents 5%. So basically, that little study said that if you're looking at just pure think tank numbers invited onto The Drum...
It's not really a good guide to The Drum, though, because the number of people who appear on the panels from think tanks is a pretty small number.
Anyway, when it comes to think tanks,
the vast majority of the people on the panels are not from think tanks, and the vast majority are clearly left or centre left. I think it's safe to say they do have the token conservative on occasionally. I've noticed, but
that was the only study I could find that actually attempted to do some numbers on that. That was for the drum. But then on Q&A, this is a report from 2015 done by Ray Martin and Sean Brown. I'm assuming the Ray Martin is the Ray Martin of
TV fame.
60 Minutes sort of fame.
I saw him in a restaurant once.
Right. Did you?
Did you go and introduce yourself?
Nah. I should have. Didn't get his autograph either.
So this is a 2015 report where they looked at 23 programs of Q&A. Do you think Q&A is biased?
Religiously,
I think Q&A is just a rabble.
Okay, rather than biased, it's just
rather than biased. Yeah.
Okay, then I won't go through it.
I mean, you didn't like the original.
I didn't like
moderator.
Tony Jones. No, I can't. I've never liked it because it's a fatally flawed system where you've got any number of people asking questions and then a quick soundbite from a bunch of people. You can't get into the deep philosophical, into the woods like we get on this podcast.
I agree with you. The format is flawed, but yes. I thought Tony Jones did a better job of moderating than the current moderator.
So in the show notes, dear listener, you can find a whole bunch of tables where they looked at representation on the Q&A panel in a 12-month period, and you certainly couldn't say that it was biased to Labor or the left after running through all of the numbers that they picked up there. So,
do you watch the drum?
No.
No. Joe? None of you watch the drum. I used to watch it. I can hardly bring myself to watch it these days, but I do occasionally. And it's clearly, I don't know if left wing is the right term, but it's clearly not conservative. I'll put it that way.
I just find it too annoying to watch. It's so
very annoying.
Fluffy and
very, very annoying. I agree.
I don't really want to. Actually, sporting boycotts. Here's an interesting one. So baseball in America. So who would have thought that Major League Baseball would make a strong political statement? So the Major League Baseball has pulled its 13th of July All-Star game and the 2021 draft from Atlanta. They're not going to hold it in that city anymore because of changes to Georgia's voting laws. So as many people see, those changes are disproportionately affecting the black and minority communities. So Major League Baseball has said, you bunch of fuckers, we're not going to have we're not going to have the All-Star game in your city.
Use such profane language.
That's an interesting event where they've said, due to your poor behaviour when it comes to democracy.
I was surprised by this too.
And it's not the first time though.
Isn't it?
For baseball?
I don't know about for baseball. I know that certain sporting events were cancelled because of the whole bathroom bills 2-3 years ago.
The what?
The fact
they were having a bathroom built.
No. Trans women weren't allowed to use women's toilets in America.
Right.
A whole bunch of cities passed laws, or it was Alabama.
Right.
Can't remember.
Okay. And so major sporting franchises said we're not going.
Basically.
Okay. Well, here's another one.
Yep.
So that's interesting because baseball is sort of a rich white man's game in America. So it's just interesting that they took a view like that. You wouldn't have expected that sport to get involved in that sort of thing.
They would have a fair number of black players in baseball, wouldn't they?
Compared to other sports, it's quite low on the scale.
Really?
Let me just see here, because it actually gives the...
It does say 8%.
Yeah, it did say it there somewhere. If you can find it for me, Joe.
Yeah, most MLB owners are conservative in their politics.
Yep.
Black players in MLB account for only 8% of team rosters.
8%. It's quite low. Okay, so that's that. And the next question will come up is this Winter Olympics in China. And there's talk now about who is going to boycott the Winter Olympics. And in response to their human rights record. Paul, have you got any thoughts on boycotting Winter Olympics in China based on human rights record?
I haven't really given it any thought, to be honest. How about you guys?
I remember the Soviet Olympics being boycotted back in the 80s, was it?
By the United States?
And Australia. Well, Australia made it difficult. There's a number of countries that boycotted.
Because the Soviets boycotted the Los Angeles Olympics, the next one after.
And I think they created a category for sort of people who had, if your country didn't go and you wanted to attend anyway, and you could afford to get there, you could play for or represent an unaligned country.
That was more recent, wasn't it? And Russian athletes were allowed to compete after that drug scandal at Sochi, wasn't it?
Oh.
You remember at Sochi where they had the Winter Olympics in Russia, and it was discovered that the Russian officials had been tampering with the blood samples. And so the whole Russian team was banned at the following Winter Olympics. But individual Russian athletes were allowed to compete if they could sort of demonstrate that they were clean.
Don't know about that. But anyway, I think it could be interesting over the next little while where they're considering whether to...
They'll have to pull Japan off first, COVID-free, and manage all that before we even consider it, don't we?
Yeah, it's going to be complicated, isn't it?
Yes. Yeah. But I think people are getting into a mood to...
Against China.
So it wouldn't
it's
surprise
building,
me.
yeah. It's building.
Okay. Well, I reckon that 9:03, the Shark Tank is closed. You're safe for another week, Shay.
Indeed. Thank you.
Thanks in the chat room. There were good comments throughout there. Nice to be back. The rest of Australia has joined us in terms of a time frame. So Bronwyn and others in southern states are can go to bed can listen to the program, watch it, and go to bed in a good hour. We'll be back next week. Talk to you then.
Good night.
Bye, everyone.
And it's a good night from him.